Welcome back to Neurophysiology, guys, with Dr. Piri. Today, we'll be discussing lecture 5 of motor system. In particular, we'll be looking at the basal ganglia. But before we go in detail the basal ganglia, you need to familiarize yourself with the general structures that are involved in motor control. So the neural structures that are involved in control of movement. So remember, the previous lecture, we discussed the descending pathways, which were basically upper motor neurons that were descending down to the spinal cord. From the cortex, which we call the pyramidal system, then from the brainstem, the extrapyramidal system, they are descending down. Okay, so those that are coming from the cortex, the corticospinal, they will descend down to the spinal cord. Then we also had the cortical nuclear, which are also called the corticobulbar tract, that are originating from the cortex, but they are just ending at the level of the brainstem. Then we also had the extrapyramidal, that we are starting from the nuclei within the brainstem, descending down all the way to the spinal cord. Then these neurons, they are communicating with the lower motor neurons that are innervating the specific muscles that are involved in movement. So you can see it here that we have the motor cortex and the brainstem. The motor cortex is involved in planning, initiating, and directing voluntary movements. The brainstem centers, they are involved in basic movements and postural control, but they are receiving input from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. The basal ganglia is getting proper initiation of movement to the cortex and the brainstem centers. We also have the cerebellum that is involved in sensory motor coordination. The cerebellum, we'll discuss it in lecture 6. So today we're just interested in basal ganglia that is also involved in modulation of motor movements. So from the cortex and the brainstem centers, they will descend. These upper motor neurons will descend down to the spinal cord. So you can see at the level of the spinal cord, we have the spinal cord and the brainstem circuits. So these are local circuit neurons that are involved in integration of certain information. So they are integrating information that are coming from the receptors. For instance, we have the sensory input, the receptors that are sensitive to certain stimuli that are also involved in reflexes. Once they are stimulated, they are going to fire an action potential via the afferent fibers. They are going to project to the central nervous system to communicate with the integrating centers that are now stimulating the motor neurons, and these lower motor neurons are innervating specific muscles that could be involved in reflexes. So these centers that level the spinal cord or brainstem, they're also receiving information from the upper motor neurons. And these upper motor neurons, they are regulated by the basal ganglia that is involved in coordination of these movements. So now, once we know the basal ganglia, what are the main objectives of this lecture, since we are discussing the basal ganglia? So the key take-home message here, it means at the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the components of the basal ganglia without a challenge, should be able to describe the function of the basal ganglia and the functional circuit of the basal ganglia. So there are two circuitry of the basal ganglia. We have the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. So you need to know these pathways and the neurotransmitters that are involved in each pathway. So because there's a bit of information, I will just spend maybe the first 40, 30 minutes to discuss these parts of the basal ganglia. Then the last part, we are going to discuss movement disorders or motor disorder. This is where we're going to discuss Parkinson, Huntington, and other diseases associated with the motor function. So let's start by looking at the major components of the basal ganglia. So there are 4 major components of the basal ganglia. The first one is called the neostriatum. The neostriatum is composed of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum is a combination of the nucleus accumbens and the olfactory tubercle. So if you combine the nucleus accumbens and the olfactory tubercle, it forms the ventral striatum. This is not involved in motor function. It's involved in other things like emotion and addiction. Addiction maybe to sex, drugs, exercise, and also experience of pleasure. So that experience of pleasure is the function of the ventral striatum, which is not a motor function, but is part of the basal ganglia. Then the second major component of the basal ganglia is the periostriatum. The periostriatum is composed of globus pallidus, external segment, and globus pallidus, internal segment. So these globus pallidus, external and internal segment, globus pallidus simply mean a pair of globes. So a pair of globes. So this pair of globes, you have two. We have the external and the internal segment of globus pallidus. Then the third major component is the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is composed of two parts. We have the pars compacta, where we do have a lot of dopaminergic neurons that are projecting to the striatum. Then we also have the pars reticulata that also receive input from the striatum. So the substantia nigra is also communicating with the striatum. So it's not just sending feedback to the striatum, but it's also receiving input from the striatum. Then via the substantia nigra, it can communicate with the periostriatum. It is periostriatum, you're talking of the globus pallidus, internal part of it, internal segment. Then the last major component is the subthalamic nucleus. So the subthalamic nucleus, this is where you have neurons that are projecting to the globus pallidus internal segment, which is involved in the indirect pathway. So the indirect pathway, you have the subthalamic nucleus that we'll discuss later on. So these are just the four major components of the basal ganglia. So when you're looking at the brain, at different levels, if you have the coronal section of the brain at different levels, you can appreciate these structures of the basal ganglia. And you know to say that the basal ganglia is derived from the telencephalon. So you have the two hemispheres and also the basal ganglia. So these basal ganglia is just a group of cell bodies embedded within the brain itself. Under normal circumstances, it's supposed to be called basal nuclei because a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system, they are called nucleus. In the peripheral nervous system, they are called ganglia. But there's just one exception here. So there's just one exception. So this exception is the basal ganglia. So this is the only ganglia that you will find within the central nervous system. And it's a group of nuclei, same ones that are discussed with you, that are derived from the telencephalon. And other parts of the basal ganglia, they are also derived from the diencephalon. Because you know to say, even the thalamus is communicating with the basal ganglia. So the thalamus is a component of the diencephalon. Then we also have contributions that are coming from the midbrain. The midbrain is the mesencephalon. Midbrain, this is where you find the substantia nigra. Okay, so from this cross-section of the brain, you can appreciate the components of the basal ganglia here. You have the caudate nuclei that is adjacent to the ventricles, the lateral ventricles. You have the caudate nucleus. Then you can also appreciate the thalamus. So the thalamus, though is not very visible here, you can also appreciate the putamen. So the combination of the caudate nucleus and the putamen, these are called striatum, corpus striatum, or a body which is striped, a body that is striped, because there are projections that are communicating between the caudate and the putamen. So you find that the caudate nucleus is connected to the lentiform nucleus. The lentiform nucleus is a combination of the putamen and the globus pallidus, external and internal, because it looks like a lens. That's why it's called a lentiform nucleus. In between the caudate and the putamen, or the lentiform nucleus, this is where you find the internal capsule. So you have the posterior limb of the internal capsule where those pyramidal fibers are passing. On this other one, you can appreciate the thalamus here now. So you can see the thalamus, the two thalami, and the components of the basal ganglia, the caudate nucleus. Then you can also appreciate the putamen, the globus pallidus, both external and internal component of the globus pallidus. It's basically the same diagram here showing you the major components of the basal ganglia just within a minute. So we have the caudate nucleus here. So this arrow is not, the arrow is not pointing at the correct thing here. So we have the caudate nucleus. Then we have the putamen shown in yellow. Then we have the globus pallidus, which is the internal part and the external part. So internal globus pallidus and the external globus pallidus. Then we have the putamen. The combination of these structures, it's called the lentiform nucleus. But the combination of the putamen and the caudate nucleus, it's called the corpus striatum. So the corpus striatum is the main input to the basal ganglia. So the cerebral cortex sends projections to the basal ganglia via the corpus striatum, which is a combination of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Then down here, you can appreciate the subthalamic nuclei on both sides of the brain, subthalamic nuclei. And under there, in the midbrain, you can appreciate the substantia nigra. So it has got two parts, substantia nigra pars compacta, which has got a lot of dopaminergic neurons. Then we have substantia nigra pars reticulata. So the pars reticulata is the one that is receiving input from the striatum and also from the cerebral cortex. This diagram is just showing regions of the cortical input to the basal ganglia, so shown in blue here. So everything that is shown in blue here, it will send information to the basal ganglia. So you can see that the basal ganglia is receiving information from a larger portion of the cerebral cortex because it's the one that is involved in coordination of motor movements. So from these cortex or cortical area, you have projection of neurons that are projecting to the basal ganglia. So from different portion of the brain cortex, so you can see that you have the motor loop. This motor loop mainly is the neurons that are originating from the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, supplementary motor cortex. So these neurons, they are projecting to the striatum. So mainly the motor loop is projecting to the putamen. So you can see here that we have the motor cortex, premotor cortex, and somatosensory cortex that is projecting to the putamen. So this is the input to the basal ganglia. From here, from the putamen, there are neurons which are called medium spine neurons that are projecting to the lateral globus pallidus internal segment. Then from here, they'll project to the ventrolateral and ventroanterior nuclei of the thalamus. So this is just one pathway, an example of a direct pathway, but we'll discuss them later on. But I just want you to appreciate which part of the cortex is projecting to which part of the basal ganglia. Then the middle part here, we have the prefrontal loop, which is associative area that is also projecting the basal ganglia. So we have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that is projecting to the striatum via the anterior caudate, so the caudate nucleus, that will project to the globus pallidus, internal segment, substantia nigra, pars reticulata. So you can see that the caudate nucleus is sending input to the substantia nigra, the pars reticulata. From here, these components, they are projecting to the thalamus via the medial dorsal and the ventral anterior nuclei of the thalamus. From here, the information will project back to the cortex. Then we have the limbic loop that is involved in the limbic system to do with addiction, emotions, and other functions of the basal ganglia. So the part of the cortex that is contributing to the limbic loop, we have the anterior cingulate, then we have the orbitofrontal cortex that are contributing. So you can see from the amygdala, the hippocampus, the orbitofrontal, the anterior cingulate, and the temporal cortex. These are projecting to the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum is the one that is composed of mainly the nucleus accumbens and the olfactory tubercle that is involved in emotion and other things. So those, they'll project to the ventral pallidum. From the ventral pallidum, it will project to the medial dorsal nucleus or the thalamus. That will now later on project to the cortex. Neurons of the basal ganglia. So this is just a typical example of a neuron that is found within the basal ganglia, those nuclei. So these neurons, the major one is called the medium spiny neuron. So this medium spiny neuron, it has got a lot of dendrites that are communicating with a lot of neurons. So you can see the projections from the corticopyramidal neurons that are stimulating this medium spiny neuron. Then you can also appreciate the dopaminergic neuron that are coming from the substantia nigra, especially the pars compacta. Then we also have local circuit neurons that enable the communication of one nuclei of the basal ganglia with another nuclei of the basal ganglia. So these will also project to other structures of the basal ganglia, like globus pallidus or the substantia nigra, pars reticulata. Then later on, they will communicate via the thalamus to the cortex. So I just want you to appreciate the convergency that is taking place here. You can see that one major medium spine neuron is communicating with several of other neurons here. So you have convergence. You will start with a lot of cells communicating with less cells. Those less cells will also communicate with more less cells, just like that. This is called convergence. That is also very important. So the spine, the medium spine neuron, they have connections with other neurons. So you can see that you can have these axons that are connecting with the spines of the spine neuron. Then some of them, they are connecting with the axon, the spine neuron, and some of them, they are connecting with the cell body. So you can see these are dopaminergic axons from the substantia nigra that are communicating with the medium spine neuron. And these medium spine neuron of the basal ganglia, mainly they are GABAergic neurons. So if they are GABAergic neurons, it means they are inhibitory in function. Because remember, glutamate is stimulatory. So those pyramidal cells or pyramidal axons that are communicating with the medium spiny neuron, they are stimulatory in function because they are releasing glutamate to stimulate the spiny, medium spine neurons. Then the projection that is coming from the substantia nigra, it depends with the receptors because we have dopaminergic receptors. Some of them are inhibitory and some of them are excitatory. So we have D1, which is excitatory, and D2 receptors, which are inhibitory. So it depends with which receptor are being stimulated by those axons of neurons that are projecting from the substantia nigra. Then the medium spiny neuron, they are always inhibitory because they are going to release GABA. And this GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, is inhibitory. We say that GABA, when it goes and binds those GABAergic receptors, it will bring about influx of chloride, and chloride is negatively charged. So if the neurons are gaining negatively charged ions, they become hyperpolarized. If they are hyperpolarized, then they're becoming less sensitive. So it's inhibitory. So GABA is inhibitory. Neurotransmitter, which is inhibitory. Glutamate, stimulatory. Dopamine is dependent on the receptors. Okay, so this is the convergency that I was talking about. You can see you have the medium spine neuron here of the basal ganglia that is communicating with several neurons that are descending from the cortex. So you can have 150 million neurons that are communicating with only about 30,000 neurons of the striatum. So the ratio here is 500 to 1. Then the 30,000 neurons of the striatum, these are now the medium spine neurons. They will communicate with about 100 neurons of the globus pallidus external. And the globus pallidus external, you'll find that they will just communicate with one neuron of globus pallidus internal or substantia nigra or the subthalamic nucleus. So you can see here, we have the subthalamic nucleus and the globus pallidus internal. So this is called convergence, whereby a lot of neurons are communicating with fewer neurons, and those fewer neurons are communicating with less neurons, and those less neurons are communicating with maybe one neuron. So there is convergence here of information. That's why the basal ganglia is going to regulate motor function, because a lot of information, they are sending their information to the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia will just send a precise information that will result into a motor function or a motor movement. So basically, what do the basal ganglia do? What is the major function of the basal ganglia? So these basal ganglia are involved in generation of goal-directed voluntary movements. So there are those goal-directed voluntary movements. For instance, you want to do a particular movement that requires certain precision. The basal ganglia will come here and now modulate or coordinate that particular movement. So it's involved in motor learning, motor pattern selection. So the selection of the movement. So the major functions, we have the motor function, which has got connections with the motor cortex and the thalamus. Then these mainly, they are involved in regulation or to regulate initiation and termination of movement. So the basal ganglia is involved in initiation of movement, is also involved in termination of movement. So if there is something that is destroying the function of the basal ganglia or the structures of the basal ganglia, sometimes it's very difficult to initiate movement, and also to stop movement or to terminate movement is very difficult. Like in case of Parkinson's diseases. So these Parkinson's disease, you find that it's very difficult for this patient with Parkinson or Parkinsonism to initiate a particular movement. And once the movement has been initiated, it's also very difficult for them to stop or to terminate that movement, because of the basal ganglia is not operating well for some reason that we'll discuss at the end. And some function in attention, memory, and planning. So these are other functions of basal ganglia. It's not just involved in motor function, but also other functions. These diagrams just simply summarizing the input and the output to the basal ganglia. So the major input to the basal ganglia is via the striatum, the corpus striatum, like I said. So the new striatum, in particular the corpus striatum, which is composed of the putamen and the caudate nucleus. This is where the cortex will be communicating with the basal ganglia. So you can see these neurons, axons that are descending from the cortex. They are sending information to the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, the part of the basal ganglia that is receiving that information is the corpus striatum, the caudate nucleus, and the putamen. And then from here, other neurons, these are medium spine neurons, they'll project to the other structures of the basal ganglia. Then the major output of the basal ganglia is via the thalamus. So you can see the thalamus here is receiving information from the basal ganglia. So this information, this is more like the output of the basal ganglia. So the output of the basal ganglia is via the thalamus. So in the thalamus, we have the ventral anterior and the ventrolateral thalamic nuclear complex that will receive, and then it will communicate with the other neurons that are projecting to the cortex. And these neurons are the ones that are communicating with the upper motor neurons involved in particular movement. So this is the output. Then you can also see that there is another output from the corpus striatum, especially the caudate nucleus, that is communicating with the substantia nigra. And this is the pars reticulata. So the pars reticulata is also receiving information from the basal ganglia. And then from there, the substantia nigra is also sending information to the superior colliculus. From the superior colliculus, to say it's involved in movement of the eyes or eye reflexes or tactile reflexes. Okay, so this is basically the same information. So you can see that from the primary somatosensory cortex, from the primary motor cortex, or the medial prefrontal cortex, and also the primary motor cortex, they are sending information to the basal ganglia via the corpus striatum, in particular the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So this is the main input to the basal ganglia. And there's another input to the basal ganglia that is coming from the substantia nigra, the pars compacta, that is also sending information to the basal ganglia via the corpus striatum again. So within the corpus striatum, you also have other receptors like D1 receptors for the direct pathway and the D2 receptors for the indirect pathway that are receiving information from the substantia nigra. Then the major output or the primary output to the basal ganglia or out of the basal ganglia. So there are two major outputs. So you can see via the thalamus, you have the ventral, anterior, and the ventrolateral nuclei of the thalamus. They are communicating with neurons, and these neurons are the ones that will later on communicate with the upper motor neurons. And these upper motor neurons will bring about the cortical efferents, the spinal cord, the brainstem, to stimulate those lower centers, as we've already discussed. Then on top of that, we have the subthalamic nucleus here, and this subthalamic nucleus, there's a projection from the basal ganglia, mainly the pars externa. So you can see here from globus pallidus external part is projecting to the subthalamic nucleus, and then later on, it will send information to the globus pallidus internal segment. Then that information will move to the thalamus, from the thalamus to the cortex. So here there are two pathways, the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. So sometimes it's very difficult to understand this diagram because there's just too much of information. But basically, if you understand the two pathways of the basal ganglia, then you also know the functions of the basal ganglia, then you're okay. So to reinforce your understanding of the two pathways, let me just use this illustration to draw for you and just to describe the pathways that are involved in the basal ganglia and also the function of the basal ganglia, as we'll be discussing the pathways. So this is just more like an illustration to make things easy for you to understand these pathways. So let's start. So what I need you to know by now is that there are neurotransmitters that are released by the neurons of the basal ganglia. So these neurons, the basal ganglia, some of them, they are releasing glutamate, others are releasing GABA, and others are releasing dopamine. So these are the three major neurotransmitters with regard to the function of the basal ganglia. So the neurons that are coming from the cortex to the basal ganglia via the corpus striatum, mainly they are stimulatory. So they are going to release GABA. So they are called, they are going to release glutamate. So they are called glutaminergic neurons. So we have glutaminergic neurons that are coming from the cortex to the basal ganglia via the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So those neurons, they are mainly releasing glutamate, and this glutamate is stimulatory. That's why you have a plus here. Green means go. Then from the putamen and the caudate nucleus, you have the medium spine neurons. And those medium spine neurons, mainly they are inhibitory. So they are going to release GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. So the neurons, the medium spine neurons, they are also referred to as GABAergic neurons or projections. Then from there, later on, you also realize to say that you have the substantia nigra that is communicating with other structures of the basal ganglia. So let's do the illustration here for you to understand. Okay. So we start. So this is the cortex. So let's just say this part, you have the primary motor cortex, which is M1, the primary motor cortex, M1. Then you also have other cortex before this one that are involved in motor function. In those cortex, by now you understand that we have the supplementary motor cortex. Then we also have the premotor cortex. So a plan of a particular movement, then a certain pattern of movement, selection of movements, those ideas for a particular movement, they are found within the premotor cortex. Complex movement, supplementary motor cortex. So anything that is complex, but motor function is a function of supplementary motor cortex. So this is where the neurons with the idea of that particular movement are. And on top of that, we also have the prefrontal cortex or the frontal cortex. So this prefrontal cortex is somewhere here, is also sending projections. So we have some neurons that are sending projections to the supplementary and premotor cortex, because thinking and certain ideas are stored within the prefrontal cortex that should also communicate with the supplementary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. So these neurons are the ones with that idea. So before they stimulate the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, that will contain the upper motor neurons that will descend down now to the spinal cord for that particular movement. The supplementary motor cortex and premotor cortex, they need to consult the basal ganglia about how that movement can take place. So we have two pathways. I'll start by describing the direct pathway. So green shows that these neurons, they're releasing glutamate, which is stimulatory in function. So from this cortex, the supplementary motor cortex and premotor cortex, we have a neuron. So you have the cell body here within this neuron, within this cortex. Then it's sending an axon down here to the striatum. And striatum, corpus striatum, remember, we have the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So we have this projection that is releasing glutamate, and glutamate is stimulatory. So it means it's going to be a plus for this neuron because it's stimulatory. So this neuron that is stimulatory is stimulating the medium spine neuron within the striatum. And the medium spine neuron of the striatum, they are mainly inhibitory. So this neuron that is starting from here is projecting to the globus pallidus internal part. This is the direct pathway. From the globus pallidus internal part, we also have an inhibitory neuron that is starting from here. So the cell body is here. then it's projecting to the thalamus. So within the thalamus, you have two nuclei. We have the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus. Then we also have the ventral lateral nucleus of the thalamus. So you have these two nuclei, the ventral anterior and the ventrolateral nuclei, which are called the ventral anterior ventrolateral complex of the thalamus. We are going to have a stimulatory neuron from here. So from the thalami, you have a stimulatory neuron, meaning that it's going to release glutamate. So the cell body is within the thalamus. Then this one now is the one that is projecting to the primary cortex, primary motor cortex. So within the primary motor cortex, layer number 5, which are internal pyramidal cell layer, this is where you have now another neuron, and this neuron has got a specific name. So it's called the upper motor neuron. So here you have now the upper motor neuron from the cells of bats or whatever cells that will form the pyramidal or the corticospinal. So you have those that will form the corticospinal, and others will form the corticonuclear or the corticobulbar. That will just end within the brainstem. So this upper motor neuron now, you have the upper motor neuron that will descend as a pathway, the pyramidal system. So we said the pyramidal system is passing through the internal capsule, the posterior rim of the internal capsule. So it's just passing here. It goes down to the midbrain. In the midbrain, it's going to form the cerebral peduncle within the crus cerebri. Then to descend down to the pons. In the pons, they'll become scattered because you have those pontine nuclei. Then to descend down to the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, it passes through the pyramids of the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, hence the name pyramidal system. Then at the inferior aspect of the pyramid of the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, decussation will take place here. So we said about 80 to 85 of these, they are decussating to go to the contralateral side. Then on the contralateral side, they will descend down as the lateral corticospinal tracts. So these lateral corticospinal tracts, they are, if we have the cross section of the spinal cord, so let's say we have the spinal cord down here. So within the spinal cord, you know to say we have the anterior horn and the ventral horn. So this is the anterior horn. Then you have the ventral horn down here. So even here, we're going to have the ventral horn and the anterior horn. So as these fibers, they are going down because they have decussated, they'll form the lateral corticospinal tract. Then they're going to form a synapse within the ventral horn of the gray matter. From here, this is where you have the lower motor neuron starting from via the ventral root. It will join the spinal nerves. Then this spinal nerve, the lower motor neuron. So this is the lower motor neuron that is innervating a specific muscle that will bring about that desired movement or muscle movement. So this is the direct pathway. So we are saying, starting from supplementary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, where you have ideas of initiating a particular movement or a complex movement. So it's sending an input to the basal ganglia via the striatum, the corpus striatum. So it could be via the caudate nucleus or the putamen. From here, we have these GABAergic neurons, which are inhibitory. So this neuron, which is inhibitory, is communicating with another inhibitory neuron that is communicating with another neuron within the thalamus. So what happens if there is stimulation in the direct pathway? This is what I want you to understand. So if this neuron is firing an action potential, it's going to stimulate the inhibitory medium spine neuron of the corpus striatum, either the caudate nucleus or the putamen. This neuron, if it's stimulated, it's going to release GABA here. And this GABA is inhibitory. It's going to inhibit this another inhibitory neuron. So once this neuron that is projecting to the thalamus has been inhibited because of GABA here, it's not going to release GABA at the end here. So if it's not releasing GABA, it means that this neuron within the thalami now will fire an action potential that will stimulate the upper motor neuron in the primary motor cortex. And once the upper motor neuron has been stimulated, it will fire an action potential that will be moving down this motor neuron to the spinal cord. Then this upper motor neuron is communicating with the lower motor neuron. So it's going to be stimulated via the release of excitatory neurotransmitter. And this lower motor neuron is going to release acetylcholine here that will bring about muscle contraction. You know, this acetylcholine will go and bind to cholinergic receptors, an action potential, the release of calcium that will bring about muscle contraction, that particular movement. This is the direct pathway. So the other direct pathway, you have this excitatory motor neuron that is coming from the cortex, projecting to the caudate nucleus. It's another example of a direct pathway. From here, we have inhibitory neuron that is projecting to the internal segment of globus pallidus. Then it will proceed as such. So these are examples of direct pathways via the corpus striatum. Then I'm going to illustrate the indirect pathway so that we know the differences. So it means the direct pathway, once it has been stimulated, then you're going to have a specific movement that will be stimulated. But now what about the indirect pathway? So by now we know to say that the direct pathway, once it has been stimulated, then we're going to have movement. So movement is going to increase with an increase in stimulation of the direct pathway of the basal ganglia. What about the indirect pathway? So again, the pathway. Let's start with the pathway. So we are also starting from the supplementary motor cortex, the premotor cortex. This is where the idea is for that particular movement that you want to execute. So it's going to send stimulatory signal via the corpus striatum. So the corpus striatum, caudate nucleus, and putamen. So either of the two. From here, we're going to have inhibitory medium spine neuron. So we have the inhibitory medium spine neuron. So it's red because it's going to release GABA. It's projecting to the external globus pallidus. From the external globus pallidus, you also have another inhibitory neuron that is projecting now to the subthalamic nucleus. So this is projecting to the subthalamic nucleus. From the subthalamic nucleus, you have a stimulatory neuron. So from here, you have a stimulatory neuron, because it's going to release glutamate to the internal globus pallidus. So it's projecting to the internal segment of globus pallidus. Then from here, we are going to have an inhibitory neuron that is starting from the internal segment of globus pallidus and is projecting to VAVL of the hypothalamus. So this one is inhibitory now. And this is communicating with a stimulatory neuron that is projecting to the cortex. So you have a stimulatory neuron that is now projecting to the primary motor cortex. So it's projecting to the primary motor cortex. In this primary motor cortex, you have an upper motor neuron that is starting from here, starting from the primary motor cortex, descending down via the corona radiata to the internal capsule, posterior limb of the internal capsule in between the basal ganglia and the thalamus. Then it will descend down to the midbrain via the crus cerebri, forming the cerebral peduncle. It will descend down to the medulla oblongata, where it's going to decussate to the contralateral side of the spinal cord. Then it will start descending as the lateral corticospinal tract. Then it will form a synapse with a lower motor neuron. And this lower motor neuron, from here, it will go and innervate the muscles. And this muscle is innervated by this lower motor neuron. So we have this lower motor neuron 2 now. Lower motor neuron number 2. This was 1. Then we also have the upper motor neuron number 2. So if we stimulate the indirect pathway, what happens to movements? So you need to get the difference now. So the indirect pathway, we said we have this stimulatory neuron that is projecting from the supplementary motor cortex or the supplementary motor cortex and the premotor cortex down to the corpus striatum. In the corpus striatum is going to synapse with an inhibitory neuron. This is a medium spine neuron that is communicating with another inhibitory neuron in the globus pallidus external that is communicating with a stimulatory neuron of the subthalamic nucleus projecting to the internal globus pallidus, internal part of the globus pallidus, and this stimulatory neuron is communicating with an inhibitory neuron now that is synapsing with a stimulatory neuron within the thalamus. So what happens when there is a stimulation? Step by step. Of course, you're going to have a plus here because this is releasing glutamate, so it's glutaminergic neuron. So it's going to release glutamate here that is going to stimulate this inhibitory neuron. So this inhibitory neuron is going to be stimulated. And once the inhibitory neuron has been stimulated, it means it's going to inhibit the other inhibitory neuron. So it's inhibiting the inhibitor. So if it's inhibiting the inhibitor, at the subthalamic nucleus, they're going to be disinhibition, because this neuron that is supposed to inhibit this excitatory neuron has been inhibited. So the excitatory neuron now will fire action potentials. And these action potentials are going to stimulate another inhibitor neuron that is starting from the globus pallidus internal part or internal segment. And this neuron, since it's inhibitory, then the firing of action potential is going to increase because it has been stimulated. It's going to inhibit the neuron that is projecting to the cortex. So this neuron is going to be inhibited. So once this neuron is inhibited, it means that the upper motor neuron 2 here won't be stimulated. If it's not stimulated, it's not going to stimulate the lower motor neuron at this level. Then the muscle won't be stimulated here to fire an action potential to bring about muscle contraction. So you find that the indirect pathway is going to inhibit movement or to minimize movement. So the direct pathway is stimulatory. Then the indirect pathway is going to be inhibitory. So once it has been stimulated, it's going to minimize movements. So you're going to have inhibition of movements. So movements are going to minimize. So these two pathways are antagonistic in terms of function. The direct pathway is stimulatory, the indirect pathway is inhibitory with regard to movements. So this is involved in modulation. So this is called modulation, because the direct pathway is going to increase movement, but you don't want to overstimulate the direct pathway because you're going to exaggerate the movements. That's where the indirect pathway comes in to provide inhibition of that particular movement. So it's going to work as brakes of the motor system. So this is a braking system of the motor system. The indirect, they act as brakes of the motor system so that you have fine control of movement, so that you don't have to exaggerate the movement. So there's that kind of control. So I hope you appreciate the direct and the indirect pathway. So just not to say that the medium spine neurons, they are basically GABAergic, so they are inhibitory. So all the neurons that are starting from the corpus striatum or globus pallidus, internal or external, these are mainly inhibitory. Then the neuron that is coming from the subthalamic nucleus is excitatory. Then the other one will be inhibitory. But the neurons that are coming from the thalamus are mainly excitatory, so they're going to increase movements. Then from here, you can also add the function of the substantia nigra. So remember, the substantia nigra has got two components. We have the pars compacta that has got dopaminergic neurons. Then we have the pars reticulata. So the pars reticulata is receiving information. And this pars reticulata is receiving information from the caudate nucleus mainly. So you have a neuron that is projecting here to the pars reticulata. Then at the same time, it's also receiving information from the cortex. So there are also other neurons that are projecting to the pars reticulata. So once the pars reticulata is stimulated, it's going to stimulate the pars compacta. The pars compacta, you have other neurons of the pars compacta, and these are dopaminergic neurons. So let me just use a different shade. So we have from the pars compacta, we have a neuron, which is a dopaminergic neuron that is innervating the corpus striatum. So it's going to send projections to the corpus striatum, both direct pathway and indirect pathway. So to the direct pathway is working via the D1 receptors. So this medium spine neuron that's got D1 receptors of the direct pathway. The indirect pathway, they have D2 receptors. So it's going to operate via D2 receptors. So what you need to know is that D1 receptors are stimulatory. D2 receptors are inhibitory. So via this neuron, the dopaminergic neuron that is coming from the substantia nigra pars compacta is going to release dopamine to the direct pathway and also dopamine to the indirect pathway. But the same neurotransmitter on the direct pathway, it will be stimulatory. On the indirect pathway, it will be inhibitory because these are two different receptors. So it's possible that the same neurotransmitter on one part of the brain is operating as excitatory postsynaptic neurotransmitter, and on another part is acting as inhibitory postsynaptic neurotransmitter because of the difference in the receptors. So if this dopamine is stimulating the direct pathway, we said the direct pathway is going to increase movement. So the substantia nigra via the D1 receptors is going to increase movement. So movement is going to increase more. Or it's going to initiate movement. But at the same time, via the the D2 receptors, it's inhibitory. So it's inhibiting the indirect pathway. The indirect pathway is supposed to reduce movement. So if it's being inhibited, it means that the movement is also going to increase. So you find that the effect of the dopaminergic neurons that are coming from the substantia nigra pars compacta, overall, they're going to increase movement because they are facilitating the direct pathway, then they are inhibiting the indirect pathway. So in other way, they are facilitating the direct pathway, which is stimulatory to movement, then they are inhibiting the inhibitor of movement. That will bring about an increase in movement. So it's inhibiting the inhibitor. That will bring about disinhibition, increasing movements. So both D1, D2 receptors will increase movement. So now what happens if it's a disease that is destroying the cells, these dopaminergic cells? So you won't have dopamine here via the D1, you also won't have dopamine via the D2 receptors. So it means that the indirect pathway won't be inhibited. And this will bring about inhibition of movement. At the same time, the direct pathway is not being overstimulated. So the movement is there, but it's not being facilitated by the dopaminergic neuron. So you find that the movement will be slow. So it's difficult to initiate movement, and it's also difficult to terminate movements in cases of Parkinsonism. Okay. So I hope you've understood the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. But if you didn't understand, the next few slides, I'll still just summarize the direct and the indirect pathway with regard to the function of the basal ganglia. So we say that we have the cortex. So we have the primary motor cortex that are containing the upper motor neurons that are descending down. At the same time, we also have the supplementary motor cortex and premotor cortex that are sending information to the globus pallidus for a particular type of movement. So you can see from this diagram, you have the cortex and the striatum. The striatum is composed of the putamen or the caudate nucleus. And then we have
the globus pallidus external parts, the globus pallidus internal parts, and the subthalamic nucleus. On the other side, you have the substantia nigra. Then you have the thalamus, those two nuclei, the ventral anterior nucleus and the ventral lateral nucleus of the thalamus that will contain the neurons that are projecting to the cortex to stimulate those upper motor neurons that will descend down to the spinal cord or to the brainstem to stimulate the lower motor neurons that are stimulating the actual muscles for contraction. So there are certain neurons that will be tonically active. So whether there is stimulation, there is no stimulation, they are firing some sort of action potentials. So for instance, the medium spine neurons of the globus pallidus external and also globus pallidus internal, these are tonically active. So they are continuously firing those action potentials. It means that if there is no information that is coming from the cortex to stimulate the striatum, this neuron from the globus pallidus internal is sending a strong signal to inhibit the movement. So it's going to inhibit the neuron that is supposed to project to the cortex to stimulate particular motor, upper motor neurons that will bring about a movement later on by stimulating the lower motor neurons. So because there is no information that is coming from the cortex for a particular movement, then the thalamus will be inhibited to fire those stimulatory action potentials. There will be no movement. But now, there is a movement that is coming. There's a plan for you to initiate a movement. It's coming from the supplementary motor cortex or the premotor cortex. So that information now will project to the striatum. So you can see that you have glutaminergic neurons that are projecting to the striatum. This is stimulatory. So the striatum is going to be stimulated. And remember, from the striatum, you have the inhibitory neurons that are stimulated now. So you have this inhibitory neuron that has been stimulated. And this inhibitory neuron from the striatum is going to release GABA in the globus pallidus internal or the subthalamic nucleus or substantia nigra or the subthalamic nucleus here. So it's releasing GABA. So it's inhibiting the neuron that is projecting to the thalamus. So this neuron that is projecting to the thalamus is inhibitory. Once it has been inhibited, then there will be disinhibition. So this disinhibition, it means that the thalamus has been relieved of the inhibition, or the inhibition has been removed. So the thalamus becomes active. So it will fire an action potential which is stimulatory to the cortex. Then the cortex, the upper motor neurons will be stimulated. It will transmit that action potential to the brainstem and also to the spinal cord to stimulate those lower motor neurons that are going to stimulate the actual muscles. Then you have a movement. That's why we said a direct pathway will produce movements via stimulating of lower motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. So this is going to facilitate movement. Direct pathway is going to facilitate movement. Then the indirect pathway. The information from the supplementary motor cortex, premotor cortex, is going to stimulate the striatum. Before that, there was no stimulation. If there is no stimulation, you have neurons that are tonically active. So you have tonically active neuron from globus pallidus internal that is inhibiting the ventral, anterior ventral lateral neurons to fire an action potential. So you're going to have some sort of movement here. But now what happens in the direct, in the indirect pathway? So you have neurons projecting to the striatum, stimulating the striatum because these are glutaminergic neurons. The striatum is going to project to globus pallidus external. So it's going to project to the globus pallidus external. And this neuron that has been stimulated is inhibitory. So it's going to inhibit the neuron from the globus pallidus external that is projecting to the subthalamic nucleus. So here you can see the subthalamic nucleus neuron because it's inhibitory. So once it has been inhibited, there will be disinhibition at the level of the subthalamic nucleus. So you know to say from the subthalamic nucleus, you have excitatory neuron that is also releasing glutamate. So it's an example of glutaminergic neuron. And this glutaminergic neuron is projecting to the globus pallidus internal and to the substantia nigra pars reticulata. From here, globus pallidus internal, you have an inhibitory neuron that is projecting to the thalamus. So once this inhibitory neuron has been stimulated, it means it's going to send a strong signal, a strong inhibitory signal to the thalamus. That is going to inhibit the thalamus to fire action potentials. So the thalamus won't fire action potentials because it's going to be inhibited. Then the cortex won't be stimulated. The brainstem centers, the spinal cord centers are not going to be stimulated, and then this will result into inhibition of movement. So the indirect pathway is going to inhibit movement. That's why we said it's going to act as a brake system for the motor function to fine-tune a particular movement so that you don't exaggerate a movement. If you want to pick up a cup, there should be that kind of smooth movement. So you control the excitatory fibers to the muscles and the inhibitory fibers so that you can smoothly pick up that kind of a cup. So this is the indirect pathway. Combining the two, you can see here the direct pathway is stimulatory, it's going to facilitate movement. The indirect pathway is inhibitory. Somewhere in between, you have the substantia nigra that is projecting to the striatum. So we say that we have two receptors, D1 receptor, D2 receptors. D1 receptors in the direct pathway, D2 receptors in the indirect pathway. D1 is stimulatory, D2 is inhibitory. So you are stimulating the direct pathway, you are inhibiting the indirect pathway. So it means via D1, D2, movement is going to increase. Stimulatory, the direct pathway has been stimulated, that will increase the firing of the thalamus to the cortex to increase movement. The indirect pathway has been inhibited, so you are inhibiting the inhibitor of movement. That will result into stimulation of the thalamus, an increase in action potential, projection to the cortex. It will result into an increase in movement. So these two receptors, the D1, D2 receptors, it's also dependent on the neurotransmitters that are present there. So this is where modulation neurotransmitters come in. Find that the effect of two neurotransmitters will produce an action. What do I mean? So we have two types of receptors, the ionotropic receptors and the metabotropic receptors. So the glutamate receptors are examples of ionotropic receptors, and then the dopamine receptors are examples of metabotropic receptors that work via the G protein coupled receptors. The glutamate is just going to open a channel that will result into influx of ions and then to produce a response. So these two receptors can work in collaboration to produce an action. So what you need to know is that the glutamate receptors, they can operate in absence of the dopamine neurotransmitter or dopamine neurotransmitter. So the glutamate channels, they can operate with the presence of glutamate only without dopamine. But dopamine receptors, they can't operate without glutamate. So they need to be modulated. So you have direct transmission versus modulation. Direct transmission is whereby you have a neuron that is releasing glutamate to the receptor, then you have an influx of ions that will bring about excitatory postsynaptic potentials. So you find that the glutamate, when it goes and binds to glutaminergic receptors, it will open up as a channel. Influx of sodium brings about depolarization, later on produce an action potential, excitatory postsynaptic potentials. But the dopamine on its own, it has got no effect on these spinal neurons, spinal medium neurons. So with the presence of glutamate, you will see now the modulation that is coming in. So via the glutamate and the dopamine, it's going to enhance the D1 receptor. So the D1 receptors in the direct pathway, it's going to increase the glutamate receptor phosphorylation. That is going to alter ionic conductance. An increase in conductance, it means that the direct pathway has been facilitated. So it's going to enhance the direct pathway by increasing the ionic conductance of glutaminergic receptors. So it means D1 is going to amplify the cortical input to the corpus striatum. But via D2 receptors, it's the opposite. The D2 receptors in the indirect pathway is going to increase the glutamate receptor phosphorylation as well, but this is going to alter the ionic conductance. It's going to reduce the ionic conductance of the glutamate receptors. To some extent, it's going to dampen the cortical input to the striatum. So it's going to inhibit the striatum. So it's going to inhibit the indirect pathway. So if it's inhibiting the indirect pathway, it's also somehow facilitating movement. So via D1 and D2 receptors, they are both stimulating movement to some extent. So you can see in the direct pathway, you have D1 that is going to enhance the channels for sodium via the combination of the glutamate to the glutaminergic receptors that will open and increase the conductance, an increase in influx of sodium to bring about action potentials, excitatory postsynaptic potentials. That is for the direct pathway. The indirect pathway is the opposite. You can see here, the D2 receptors, they're going to alter the ion conductance of these glutaminergic receptors, which are also channels. So it's going to be inhibited. So the indirect pathway is going to be inhibited. So via D1, D2, the direct pathway is going to be enhanced. The indirect pathway is going to be inhibited. That will result into the thalamus becoming more active, stimulating the frontal cortex and also the motor cortex. That will bring about movement. So this is the end of part A. Then the other part we'll discuss later on, where we're just going to discuss motor disorders. So diseases associated with the motor system, in short. Thank you very much for your time. If you still have more questions, you can still ask those questions later on when you have an interactive lecture.